Boulevard family, glad that you are here, and if you're here physically with us, we're glad you're here. If you happen to be watching the live stream, we want to tell you that we're glad you're here and hope either way that this is a place where you feel like God is speaking to you on this day. Did you know that in homes where the father has been absent for most of the time, physically or even emotionally, that the children are 32 times more likely to face incarceration? Do you know that where fathers have been absent from the home, that there's been no relationship between them and the children, that the children are 5 times more likely to commit suicide at some time in their life? That when a child is grown up with a parent, a father who is stern and demanding. When a child grows up with a father who would rarely, if ever, give an unconditional "I love you" or a hug without conditions. That so often that child, we find, is put on somewhat of a kind of a performance treadmill, and they'll spend literally sometimes the rest of their life trying to find that approval, trying to get that "I love you" from someone, and they will be quick to tell you their successes, the trophy they got, the promotion they got, why they should be important. That when a child is grown up in an environment that might be considered punishing, where just obeying the rules is the most important thing, that they can grow up, often we find, living a life of perfection, or at least trying to be that. And they will have those expectations of not only themselves, but they eventually will have those expectations of other people. I found a number of years ago, and even as I did marriage counseling, I realized how often it is that when a woman has grown up in a home with a very distant or absent father, how often she comes into a marriage wanting more than anything the love of her husband, but sometimes unable to allow him to come in and be intimate, even emotionally, with her. A lack of the ability to be vulnerable. You know, when I was in student ministry when I started here about 37 years ago, I realized a couple things pretty quickly. I wasn't very smart, not necessarily academically not smart, although maybe that too. But I did some really dumb things. That's what I'm trying to say. I just did some dumb things. I was 23. I'll blame it on that. Okay. I mean, the list goes on, but what comes to mind is the time I took a big group out on a summer trip, and we had decided that we would put kids in inner tubes and send them down the river, which would have probably been fine, except that it rained masses that night. And so the next morning I looked out, and there's this rain-swollen, almost flood-like river with white water and like a fog down over, so you couldn't really see. And I still remember to this day, putting the last high school kid in there in a little inner tube and shoving him out in the water and saying something like, "See you at the end." And as they disappeared into the fog, realizing this was not a smart thing to do at all. And by God's grace, they all came out at the end, brought them all home. You know what? Even in that fact that I was not very wise in those things, I realized a couple things early on. I realized early on that I could walk into a room where there were girls, whether they were like little girls or whether they junior high, senior high girls, and I could notice very, very quickly, I could observe girls who did not have a good relationship with their dad. It was just obvious. They responded to males, and they wanted their attention in a whole different way. And I realized also along the way that very early on that people in the church, whether they were students or whether they were adults, that most of them really needed, I felt like, a face-to-face encounter with their father, not only their earthly father, but maybe more importantly, their heavenly Father. And so I began to work on that. As a matter of fact, one of my very, very first camps that I ever led was I called Face to Face, because that was my intention, was to bring that about and try to help those kids see God in a different way, to change their perception so they could relate to Him in a different way. And I realized that one of the primary for us, not just students, but for us as adults, that one of the primary blockers of our relationship with God, or one of the primary catalysts of our relationship with God, has everything to do, right, with the way that we see our Father. And folks, that is the why for this series. That's the why for the series. That's why when James and I were sitting down back in the fall and we began to talk about what we wanted to do for the year, that after we talked about Bringer 1, we said, you know what, our people need to experience God in a new way. They need to come face to face, and whatever that looks like for each one, that's what they need. And that's exactly why we looked at the book of John, because as we're going to see, John does exactly that. His intent is for us to become face to face with our Father in heaven. And it's also why we decided that we're going to go 12 weeks on this thing. Now, usually we try to go 4 or 6, or we go 12, but we break it into 4 and 6. So, hopefully nobody will notice that we're actually going long, because sometimes we sense a little boredom if we go very long in series. Just saying. But we're going 12. And we're going 12 because John's got a lot to say and we have a lot to learn as we begin to experience maybe God in a new and fresh way. Gospel of John. John's pretty simple in a way. I mean, John makes very, very clear that he wants those who are reading his gospel to know who Jesus is. Pretty simple. And he spends 21 chapters doing that. And he does that because the Jesus that he wants us to see clearly wants us to see the Father clearly. Jesus says, I came to reveal the Father. I came so that you could see the one who sent me more clearly, because he wants us to see that God is a God who desires more than anything to have a relationship with you, no matter where you have been or what you have done or what you're bringing to this place today. Well, the 3 Gospels, there's 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first 3, basically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, really show us Jesus, and they try to do the same thing John does. But they show us primarily by stories. They have their audience, and they share stories to get us to see what Jesus is like. John has a little bit different approach. He shares the stories, but he also draws these incredible pictures for us. And I'll just tell you, when James and I were sitting there talking, and I said, you know what, I really want our people just to see Jesus. And he said, well, where do you want to go? And I said, you know what, John's a picture guy, and I'm a picture guy. I think hopefully I can help our people to see Jesus a little bit more clearly through John's stories. But he not only draws these pictures for us, which I think you're going to really enjoy, he also comes behind it with some incredibly tough, penetrating questions. And then it's like after he gets these questions, it's like he says, can you see him? Are you getting this? That's John. So the bottom line, before we ever even get started, is if I could share this kind of in layers, that what we see is, again, that John wants people to know it without a doubt who Jesus is. And Jesus wants us to know without a doubt what the Father looks like. And the Father sends Jesus because he wants a relationship with us, his creation, you, so that you can know him and so that you will trust him more than you do on this day, and that you will learn to love him. That's what the Father wants. And I'm going to just say this, just a one-on-one, heart-to-heart, folks. That's what we want. As you, as my brothers and sisters, that's what I want for you. I'm not saying that I've got it and you don't. I'm saying I just want us. I just want us as a family here at Boulevard to experience God in some new and fresh ways. I want that to happen for you personally. My favorite passage from the Old Testament has been for decades now. Something David said in one of his songs. And this is what I desire for myself. It's actually, I've told my sons, it's what I want on my tombstone. This is what I want for you. David says, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I might dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the Lord and to seek him in his temple. That's what we want for you. Well, we talk about the background of John for just a little bit so you kind of know where this guy's coming from. We're introduced to him, at least by Mark. And he says that when Jesus came along, he had just invited Peter and Andrew to follow him. And then he goes a little bit further and he finds John and he finds his brother James. And they're also fishermen. And it says he extends the call, and basically kind of in Mark's own immediate and now kind of conversations, he says that they left and followed Jesus, leaving their father in the boat. And so, I mean, that's how quick this all happened. So John immediately says, that's a guy I want to follow, and that's what he did. And most people would tell you that John was probably, they believe him to be very young, actually probably like comparable to today's high school student when he began to follow Jesus. And then we know that where most of the other three writers, their gospels were written within 20 to 30 years of after actually spending time with Jesus. Most of them were written in the like 50s to 60s, somewhere in there. John did not write his till much later, way late in his life, somewhere possibly 90 AD to 100 AD. So he would have been a very old man. We don't know why that is, but boy, when he does, he lets go, man. He lets go. And for those of you who might be apologetic or archaeology kind of people, I would let you know that also something you might already know, and that is that our oldest New Testament manuscript fragment is one with the Gospel of John. It's a part of the Gospel of John. Matches perfectly to what we have here. And it was dated around 130. And so we have actually a writing, something that's been dated within possibly 30 years, not very long historically, of when John actually wrote this. I think that's kind of exciting in itself. How many of you ever heard of a guy by the name of John Rocker? Started to say John Rocker. Anybody heard of John Rocker? Okay. John Rocker was this major league pitcher for the Atlanta Braves back in the 90s. All right. And John was known for his incredible fierce competitiveness, also as well as some quotes that the media loved to put on the front page of the sports page. All right. But he was also known for this, that John Rocker, because he was a reliever, John Rocker, when he was called out from the bullpen to pitch, John Rocker played it a lot different than everybody else. If you ever watched a major league game when they call the pitcher out from the bullpen, they do this leisurely, I got all the time in the world, look at everybody's watching me, I'm going to take my time, and then they get out and then they just kind of mess around, they throw a few whatever. Not John Rocker. When John Rocker's name was called from the bullpen for him to come in and relieve the game, the gates opened wide and John Rocker came sprinting out of the bullpen and ran as fast as he could with the fiercest face you can imagine, clear out to pitching mound. That was his style. That's what he was known for. My friends went to a Hilldale game about the time John Rocker was popular, and one of their friends, a guy by the name of Justin Calvert, you might know Justin, or his father, David, and Justin was a reliever for the Hilldale. And so he had watched John Rocker. And so as the voice told it, Justin's name was called, and they opened the gate or whatever they did at Hilldale or whatever. And anyway, they called his name, and Justin comes flying out across the Hilldale outfield, across the infield, to the top. All 12 people there to watch the Hilldale Hornets went crazy. John the Apostle is a lot like John Rocker. Now, while the other writers of the Gospels kind of ease into it and they talk about his birth or they talk about some other things early in his ministry, not John. John comes out of the gate. He runs across the field. He goes to diamond. He just starts throwing like John Rocker. He just starts throwing the heat. Now, some people have said of the book of John that it is shallow enough that a child could wade in it, and it's deep enough that an elephant could swim. And so wherever you're at, This is a book for you, because where you're just getting your ankles wet as far as your Christianity, your faith, you're not even there yet. This is something you can wade into and understand. And then if you've been around a while and you're ready for some deeper stuff, there's some stuff there that'll challenge you and make you think. Some theology that's make you chew for a little bit. And along the way, John very quickly is going to answer the central question that Jesus wants to know, and that is this: who am I? Who do you believe that I am? He's going to answer the big one, that big one, and he's going to answer as we go through just in these first verses. He's going to answer 4 questions that everybody who has ever been created ask, I believe. You are the person on the other side of the hemisphere from north to south. I believe these questions are in every man's heart for a reason. John begins with this. Verses 1 through 3, in the beginning, the Word already existed. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He existed in the beginning with God, and God created everything through him, and nothing was created except through him. John just wants us to know this, okay? John wants us to know, first of all, this is language that when you hear in the beginning, where do you go to? You go to Genesis, right? In the beginning, God created. And that's exactly what John begins with. And here's the point, real simple. John wants us to know this Jesus who is the Word, Jesus was there at the beginning. When it all was created, Jesus was there. He is not created. Jesus is not created by the Father. He was there at the beginning. You might hear sometimes a term called the pre-existence of Christ, and that means only that he existed before creation. And that's mind-blowing to us in some ways. Mind-blowing. Does anything blow your mind more than the concept of time? When you start thinking back before the world was made, and all of a sudden, it's like, what was God doing before he created this little earth? And if you start thinking about way down, and when it's all said and done here, you just kind of, what's he going to do now? I mean, we operate in this dimension, this time dimension, with the clock in front of us. We can't imagine anything else. But John says he was there at the beginning. He wants us to know 3 things. First of all, that Jesus was with God. John is saying to us, Jesus is our closest connection with God. If you want to get to know what God is like, you go to Jesus, because he was there with God from the very, very beginning. We get all kinds of funky notions about who God the Father is and what he looks like. John says, look at Jesus. And then he's getting ready to take 21 chapters to show us who Jesus is so we can see what John is like. Some of you have heard me say that a couple of years ago I picked up a biography on Teddy Roosevelt. And the ironic thing about this biography was it was literally titled An Intimate Look at Teddy Roosevelt. And I just realized about 4 or 5 chapters in, this feller had never met Teddy Roosevelt. Or at least nothing that he wrote in the book would make me believe. It was all stories he had read. It was all other resources. There was not any intimacy to it. And it was very obvious that this guy was not someone who was up and close. And I closed the book and I walked away, because I don't think he was giving me a look at what Teddy Roosevelt was like at all. But Jesus does, because he was with, John says he was with God. He says the Word was God. And he could have used the terms, he could have used 2 Greek words, ho theos, which would have said that Jesus was identical to God in every way. And we would have expected him actually just to say, Jesus is identical to God. But he doesn't say ho theos. He says theos. Jesus was God. Not just identical as in twins. He says Jesus was actually God. We perfectly see what the Father's like. He has his essence. He has the same heart and mind. He is God. Folks, before I go any farther, let me just say this, that what you probably already know, that your picture, when you think about God, whatever is in your mind, whether it's a painting, an image, whether it's qualities that come to your mind, words, whatever that is, and be careful because it may be something different than you might say it is. That has everything to do with your ability and willingness to communicate with him honestly and openly. If you have a earthly father that some of you do, who you know that you could go and be completely honest with him about whatever is going on in your life. You could even say, hey, you really hurt me when you did this. You could say, I'm really, really feeling this particular way today. You could be vulnerable with him about whatever's going on in your life. And because of their quality, their character, who they are, that they would allow that and love you unconditionally and maybe even put their arms around you or maybe apologize. And some of you have lived with earthly fathers that that could never, ever happen. You could not be that vulnerable, that honest, that forthcoming because you know the character, right? Jesus wants us to know that this is a Father who's the kind of God and who desires more than anything that you and I come face to face with him in a way where we can be vulnerable and honest. I've got a really good friend who grew up with an emotionally distant father. Just not a bad dad, in a sense. Just far off emotionally. And he suffered some pretty severe consequences in his life somewhat as a result of that. And it's interesting to me that now when he refers to our Father in heaven, he refers to him consistently, whether writing or in spoken word, as Dad. And that may be kind of weird for some of you, but I would remind you that Jesus, in his most traumatic time of his life in the Garden of Eden, yelled out, Abba, Father, an even more intimate Daddy. So the answer to the first question is this, that if we find out that Jesus was there at the beginning, that he is our creator, that we find our purpose in him as our creator. We find our purpose in him as our creator. He is our designer. If you want to know what your purpose is, if you want to know why something works or what it was created for, whatever it is, manufactured, where do you go? Do you go to the designer of that? You don't go just to the guy who's putting it together on an assembly line. No, you go to the person who put it together with the purpose in mind. We find our purpose in him as our creator. And folks, listen, man, we are made. That Genesis vibe that's there in the beginning God created. If you read a little bit farther on in Genesis, what you find is that we are created in his image, that we actually resemble. And one of the very, very first commands that God gives us is this: go forth and multiply. Why would he say that? Not just so we can have sex and have children, although that's a great part of it also. But also the real reason he said go forth and multiply was this, because he intended us as his children to reflect the nature and the quality, the character of the Father. So as we multiplied and as we scattered around the world, we would be little fathers around. People could see God the Father in us. Folks, that is the why. That's the purpose for us going out. That's a purpose for you going to work. That's a purpose for you going to school. That's a purpose for you going to the ball field. To be a reflection, and that is enough. And if we get the answer to the why question, which is we're to scatter out so we can be a reflection of God, really the geography thing is not as big a deal. We get caught up as, am I in the right place? Remember that everywhere you go, you are sent. You are sent. Well, John says God sent a man in verse 6. John sent a man, John the Baptist, to tell about the light so that everyone might believe because of his testimony. And John himself was not the light. He was simply a witness to tell about the light. The one who is the true light, who gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. We're going to kind of skip the light and life stuff. A good composer will actually introduce themes that he wants to present in his music, he'll present those actually very, very early on, and then you'll see them in the middle and you'll see them at the end. It's exactly what God does in John. He presents this concept of light and life, and then in just a few chapters, and then at the very end of the book, we're going to see Jesus consistently being light and talking about the fact that he is life. John was not that life or light. John was simply the one to introduce it. And I would just share with this maybe three things that I would love you to see this. That first of all, it says that John was sent. He was sent. He was the same command that you and I get in Genesis. He was sent out. And the multiplication, what was he told to do? He was told to tell. He was sent to tell so that other people could believe. Folks, that's not just a John the Baptist commandment. That's exactly what Genesis tells us. We are to go out, as we've been talking about in January, bring your one, to tell other people, to be a reflection of the Father. We tell so others will know. And folks, let me just say this, as we look for our purpose in life, as we look for any way that we can make an impact, anything that we are doing or any way we are trying to obtain success, which does not have at its core our being a reflection of God the Father, is off course. I don't care how good it looks. I'm not interested in someone's success if it's success without God smack dab in the middle of it. It's not the purpose that he created us for. No matter how much money is in the bank, no matter how big the house is we build, no matter how wonderful and cool our family is, if it doesn't have him at the core and we're not reflecting him, it doesn't matter. It's not our purpose. But John answers. John answers and he goes out. He does exactly what he understands, that God is God and he is not. He says, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not the chosen one. He's coming, but it's not me. So John understands his purpose and he's able to make an impact on the lives of others because this he knows. He knows who God is, and because he knows who God is, he knows who he is. And don't miss the importance of that. When we understand who he is fully, who we are fully, and our purpose comes more clearly into view. And that's the answer to the second question. John first found his purpose, and we find our purpose in him. And number two, we will make a difference in the lives of others when we know his call for our lives. And folks, that doesn't have to be a big thing. We had a guy come several weeks ago, and he came basically with the idea, I'm going to come once, but I'm not going to come again. And when he came, he was met at the door by one of our greeters. And that greeter caught his eye as he approached the door, and he looked him in the eye, and he shook his hand warmly and firmly, and he looked him and he said, man, we're so glad that you're here. And he said it in a way that I believed it. That greeter, I'm not even sure who it was, made an impact in the life of someone he didn't even know. Because that man came back. And he's going to keep coming. He wants to be a part of this because he believes we're a people who care about people. And you know what? Is anybody, I wish he could stand up. If I knew who he was, I'd have him stand up. Is there anybody here who can't look somebody in the eye and extend a hand and say, man, I'm really glad that you came today? Making an impact on the lives of others isn't always as difficult as we want to make it. Something crazy happened. As if it wasn't crazy enough, something crazy happens in verse 14. It says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Word, Jesus, came to earth in flesh. Whoa, that's heavy stuff. And he made his dwelling amongst us. And I really had kind of always passed over that. And then I thought, you know what? I think if I was Jesus, I'd have built a palace. I think if I was Jesus, I would have been looking on, like VRBO or something. I'd look for I'd like, where can I stay while in my brief time there that I would be very comfortable and could be partially impressive to those who want to follow me. When it says Jesus dwelt among us, it wasn't just on earth. Jesus walked around. Matter of fact, if anything, it says that he had no place to lay his head. He dwelt among us, and it says of him that he came full of grace and truth. That has become one of the most significant verses in the scriptures to me. The idea of Jesus coming with grace, and grace being at least two things. One, undeserved, something that we get, something that we do not deserve. That's hard for us to get our hands around. We get something that we do not deserve over and over and over again. And Jesus lived perfectly, if you watch his ministry, that idea of giving people what they did not deserve. He didn't ask about their past. He was looking for faith. And then there was on another side, not only did he give them what he didn't deserve, but he also, grace has this idea of beauty or winsomeness about it. The idea that when Jesus was talking with people, that people seemed to want to follow him. Not just because he demanded it, but because there was somehow this kindness about him, this care about him, that he literally cried at times when he saw them like sheep without a shepherd. And man, we could learn so much about that as we are dealing with people. But he had this grace about him. And at the same time, it says that he was full of truth, full of grace and truth. Man, those two things seem to be contrasting to me. They seem to hit heads, you know? Like you meet people who you go walk away and go, well, that's really a truth person. Whew! They just tell the truth, whether it hurts or not. And then some people you walk away and you just go, man, that's really a grace person. And we don't think the two can coexist. And so I was trying to figure out a way to show you this. And so this is what I came up with. Next slide. There you go. That's grace on the left and truth on the right. Don't let that beautiful, soft smile fool you, folks. Okay? I've been married for 38 years, parented 4 boys with that. Okay? That girl wants the truth. Justice. What do you think we should do to discipline them? Well, you know, Dawn, maybe I should go up and have a little conversation with them. I was thinking about shooting them, actually. I mean, man, if Dawn told each one of our boys, if you ever lie, I will know about it. And she would. It was like her and God had this thing, you know. I mean, if they lied, she knew about it. And man, I mean, there was Hector to pay. We have existed together, us, grace and truth. We have battled it out at times. Jesus didn't. Somehow grace and truth existed in this one person in the same way. I don't get it, but I wonder, and I really honestly, I think about, maybe you can think about this with me, what my marriage would be like if I'd always been a husband full of grace and truth. What as a father I would have been like, and even still to this day, if I could live as a father full of grace and truth. As a coworker, as a person who's a shepherd with you, if I could always do ministry with grace and truth, if in my relationships, how about if you and I could always do grace and truth? And it's one of the things, I find this hopeful as we explore the book of John. We're going to see Jesus time and time again, examples of him being full of both. It's a beautiful thing to behold. And it's unexpected all the time. I was reading this morning about, and he takes the man who was paralyzed or at the pool of Siloam, and he can't get in the water, and he says, just stand. So he gives him this grace, and the man goes away. Jesus goes the other way. That's it. Jesus comes to find him in the temple later on. He finds him. You know what he says to him? Not, hey, glad those legs are working for you. He goes, hey, don't sin any longer or something worse might happen to you. Oh, well, there's a bit of truth. Grace and truth to the same feller. exactly what he needed. I'm excited to find out what Jesus has to show us about grace and truth. But here's the answer to the third question, folks. When we experience grace the way God wants us to experience grace, and when we exercise truth, and a lot of us know truth, but we don't live by truth, we could go on that one down the road. How many of us live by lies? Although we've been taught the Bible since Sunday school when we were 4 or 5 years, we still believe things about ourselves, about others, and about God, and we act on those things. We make decisions on those things. We ruin relationships and our own relationship with God because we know the truth, but we live by lies. And folks, when we find real freedom, or we will find real freedom in our life when we experience grace as God has it for us, and when we begin to exercise the truth that God has for us. John 1:18 says, "No one has ever seen God, but the unique one who is himself God is near to the Father's heart, and he has revealed God to us." Here's the answer to the fourth question, real quickly. The fourth question that people want to know, it's in our hearts. How do I know God? Who is this? Who is this person? Where did this world come from, and how do I know him? That's the answer to the fourth question. The fourth answer to the fourth question is that we learn to know God the Father as we pursue Jesus. And that's another reason I'm so excited about this series, because we pursue Jesus by learning more about him, by watching his life, by learning. And we pursue Jesus, don't miss this one, by hanging out and rubbing shoulders with other people who know Jesus. I learn some of my best experiences about Jesus and my best lessons about Jesus by hanging out regularly in the presence of people who know Jesus well. That's so important, that you and I are spending time not only in the Word, but with the people who are spending time in the Word. And Jesus says, John says of Jesus, he has revealed God to us. We can know him better. We can know the Father better. We can understand his heart that beats for us better. We can see him face to face more clearly and look into the beauty of his face without shame as we come to know Jesus. That's what he wants. I'm going to bounce back for just a second as we close today, and that is this. Back to 1:10. Something crazy happens again. He came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. Wow. He came. Jesus, who was God, comes to earth, and those he created did not even recognize who he was. John takes it a step further. He came to his chosen people, the children of Israel, and not only did they not recognize him, John says, they rejected him. I would remind you that rejection has a lot of faces, right? And we can talk about them all day long, but for us, rejection has a lot of faces. You can feel rejected if someone throws rocks at you, but you can feel rejected if someone just refuses to look you in the face. You can feel rejected if someone just continues to not give you any value or recognize or respect your identity. There's all kinds of ways that we can reject someone, and Jesus suffered them all. He was not recognized by his creation. He was rejected by his own people. It strikes me that most of the people that I have visited with over the years have not rejected God because of research. They have not decided that God is not who he says he is, that Jesus is not who he says he is, because they have just researched, they have read so many books, and they've just come to this logical, analytical decision. This just doesn't make sense at all. Might happen sometimes, I'm sure. But I believe that most of the time people, when having an opportunity to experience God, the Son Christ, that most of the time we reject him because one of two reasons. One, he has not met some expectation that we have had of him. And so we won't go face to face with him any longer. You didn't keep my promise. I prayed for my marriage, for reconciliation of my marriage. We got a divorce. I prayed for my grandma when I was 15 for her not to die of cancer, because she was the only one who cared for me, and she died, and I was alone. You weren't there for me. I prayed for my child. Oh, why did you allow my child to be abused at the hands of this person, this beast? Where were you, protector? And we had this expectation somehow that we believe God should have come and done for us what we felt was fair or kind or loving. And he didn't come through in the way that we thought, and so rejection takes place. And I have my own situations in my life that I struggle with sometimes with that. Wondering, when is he going to act? When are you going to do what you've told me you are going to do? So I feel for you in those situations. And I think the other reason sometimes that we reject God, and whatever that rejection looks like, whether it's hostile or passive or whatever it might be, is simply because we just won't want to call him Lord. We just don't want to give up control. We just don't want to take our hands off the steering wheel, off the horns of the bull, because we might be involved in doing something that we just don't want to give up. We just don't think he is enough. And God wants nothing more to say to you than, I am enough. I am Jehovah, the Lord Almighty, El Shaddai. I have everything you need. And so this morning, I just have to ask you that question. Are you able to face God face to face? And is there any area of your life where he might feel rejected by you because he has not met an expectation that you had? And so your prayers have been surface level, somewhat empty prayers. You don't want to go to any of the deep stuff. Or maybe there's an area of your life, although you might be a believer, but that you're still hanging on and trying to control the semblance, the look-alike of control, although God would laugh at that because we're not in control of anything. Folks, these next 11 weeks, we want you. But God wants you even more. He wants you to know that he is the kind of God who so desires to go face to face with you as his children. He wants you to be able to look at him face to face and trust him and love him and place control of your life into his hands. And so I just hope you'll be there. I hope you make it a priority just to be here and see who this Jesus is and learn new things and experience wonderful freedom and learn how you can go face to face with the Father in a way that you've never experienced him, in a way that you've never experienced him before. If that's something that you're ready to do, ready to take a step forward, wow, we'd love to have you today. If you want to come and just say, hey, I just need to get a cup of coffee, I got some questions, we would love that too.